The morning of August 17, 1945, arrived with an unsettling silence over the coastal village of Shirahama, nestled along the southeastern shore of Kyushu. 2 days had passed since Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender, yet the reality of peace felt distant and uncertain. For the villagers, the war's end brought not relief but confusion and fear of what the American occupation would mean. Sergeant Thomas Brennan of the 1st Cavalry Division stood at the edge of the village square, observing the subdued movements of the local population. At 27, the Missouri native had survived Leyte and Luzon, witnessing the brutal final months of the Pacific Campaign. His unit had landed on Kyushu's coast 3 days earlier as part of the initial occupation force, expecting resistance that never materialized. "They won't even look at us," remarked Private Eddie Kowalski, a lanky kid from Chicago who'd joined the regiment only 5 months prior. "Like we're ghosts or something." Brennan understood the sentiment. The propaganda the Japanese civilians had endured for years painted Americans as barbaric monsters who would commit unspeakable atrocities. Now those same monsters walked their streets, and the villagers moved with heads bowed, eyes averted, waiting for horrors that wouldn't come. "Can't blame them," Brennan replied, adjusting the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Everything they've been told says we're here to destroy them." The village itself bore the scars of war's final days. Several buildings showed damage from earlier naval bombardments, their wooden frames splintered and roofs partially collapsed. The small fishing harbor sat empty, most boats either destroyed or hidden. Children peeked from doorways before being quickly pulled inside by anxious parents. Corporal James Nakamura, the unit's Nisei translator, approached with a troubled expression. His family had been interned at Manzanar while he'd volunteered to serve, earning respect through campaigns across the Pacific. "Sergeant, the village headman wants to speak with you. He seems agitated about something." Brennan followed Nakamura through narrow streets lined with traditional wooden houses. The headman, a weathered man in his 60s named Tanaka-san, waited outside a modest home, wringing his hands nervously. When he spoke, his words tumbled out rapidly in Japanese. Nakamura translated, "He says there's a problem at the old schoolhouse on the hill. Some children were playing there yesterday when part of the building collapsed. The adults are afraid to approach because they think we'll punish them for being near what used to be a military observation post." "Children trapped?" Brennan's jaw tightened. "How many?" More rapid Japanese, Tanaka-san gesturing emphatically toward the hillside. "He thinks 4 or 5. Maybe more. The building is unstable, damaged in the bombardment last month. The children shouldn't have been there, but—" Nakamura paused, his expression grim. "They were looking for food, Sergeant. The village is nearly out of supplies." Brennan felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. The schoolhouse sat nearly half a mile up the hillside, partially destroyed and dangerous. But children were children regardless of which flag their country had flown. "Get Lieutenant Morrison," Brennan ordered. "Tell him we need a rescue detail, and Nakamura, tell this man we're going to help." When Nakamura translated, Tanaka-san's eyes widened with disbelief. He spoke again, his voice trembling. "He asks why you would risk your men for Japanese children," Nakamura said quietly. "He doesn't understand." Brennan met the old man's gaze directly. "Tell him because they're children. That's reason enough." Within 20 minutes, Brennan had assembled a 6-man team. Lieutenant Daniel Morrison, a former engineering student from Ohio, approved the mission despite his concerns about the structural integrity of the damaged building. They gathered ropes, medical supplies, and wooden beams that might serve as supports. As they prepared to move out, a small crowd of villagers gathered at a respectful distance, watching with expressions that mixed fear and confusion. Mothers clutched younger children close, while elderly men whispered among themselves. The idea that American soldiers would voluntarily risk themselves for Japanese children contradicted everything they'd been taught to believe. The climb up the hillside proved treacherous. Recent rains had loosened the soil, and the path showed signs of erosion. The schoolhouse came into view as they rounded a bend, a 2-story wooden structure with traditional curved roof tiles. now partially caved in on the eastern side. Smoke still rose faintly from somewhere inside, suggesting a small fire smoldered within the rubble. "Christ," muttered Private Kowalski. "The whole thing could come down any second." Morrison examined the structure carefully, his engineer's eye assessing the danger. The main support beams on the collapsed side had snapped, leaving the remaining structure supported by weakened timber that groaned visibly in the wind. "We need to work fast," Morrison said. "Brennan, take Kowalski and Rodriguez around to the west entrance. It looks more stable. Nakamura, you're with me. We'll try to communicate with anyone inside from here." Nakamura cupped his hands and called out in Japanese, his voice echoing off the hillside. For a moment, only silence answered. Then a faint cry emerged from within the wreckage. A child's voice, weak but unmistakable. "There." Private Jose Rodriguez pointed to a gap in the collapsed wall. "I heard them, more than one." The team split up as planned. Brennan led his group around to the west side, where the entrance hung partially open, blocked by fallen timbers. They worked quickly to clear the debris, aware that every movement might trigger further collapse. "Carefully," Brennan instructed as they pried away a heavy beam. "Nice and steady." Through the opening, they could see into what had been a classroom. Desks lay overturned and plaster dust hung thick in the air. The smoke they'd seen came from a small fire near the rear of the room, where cooking oil had apparently spilled and ignited. And there, huddled against the far wall beneath a partially collapsed section of roof, were the children. Brennan counted 5 of them, 3 boys and 2 girls, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 12 years old. They stared at the American soldiers with wide, terrified eyes trembling violently. The oldest boy positioned himself protectively in front of the younger children, his face streaked with dust and tears. "Nakamura," Brennan called out, "we need you over here. They're scared to death." The translator arrived quickly and called out to the children in gentle Japanese, explaining that the soldiers were there to help them, but the children only pressed themselves harder against the wall, the oldest boy shaking his head frantically and speaking in rapid, panicked Japanese. "He thinks we're going to kill them," Nakamura translated, his voice heavy. "He's telling the others to stay quiet and maybe we'll leave, he thinks. He thinks we eat children." The absurdity and tragedy of the statement hung in the air. Years of propaganda had turned American soldiers into demons in the minds of these terrified kids. Now those same demons were their only hope for survival. "Tell him we're going to get them out safely," Brennan said firmly. "Tell him we have food and water. Tell him we're fathers and brothers too. Some of us have kids back home." As Nakamura translated, Brennan slowly removed his helmet and set down his rifle, making himself less threatening. He pulled out his wallet and extracted a worn photograph, his sister's 2 children, ages 4 and 7, smiling at the camera in their Kansas backyard. He held it up so the children could see, gesturing between the photo and himself, then pointing to the trapped children in his heart, the universal language of family. The oldest boy's expression wavered slightly, confusion mixing with his fear. He spoke again to Nakamura. "He asks why you would show him your family," the translator said. "He asks if you're trying to trick them. Tell him I'm showing him because I understand he's trying to protect the others. Tell him that takes courage. Tell him I respect that. But the building is going to collapse and we need to move now." Chapter 2. The Rescue Lieutenant Morrison appeared at the entrance, his face taut with urgency. "Brennan, we've got maybe 15 minutes before the main support beam gives way. That fire is weakening what's left of the structure. We need to evacuate now." Brennan nodded and turned back to the children. Through Nakamura, he explained the situation simply and directly. The building was falling down, they had to leave immediately, and the soldiers would help them. The children exchanged glances, their fear palpable even through the dust-filled air. The oldest boy spoke again, pointing to the smallest girl who appeared to be about 6 years old. Her leg was pinned beneath a fallen beam, and blood had soaked through her torn cotton pants. "Her name is Yuki," Nakamura translated. "She's trapped. The others won't leave without her." Morrison quickly assessed the situation. That beam is part of what's holding up the ceiling section over them. If we move it wrong, we could bring everything down on top of them. Private Rodriguez, who'd worked construction before the war, studied the problem. We need to support the ceiling first, then lift the beam. Can we get more timbers in here? No time, Morrison replied. We'll have to use what's available. Brennan made a decision. Kowalski, Rodriguez, find anything we can use as a lever and support. Morrison, figure out how to shore up that ceiling section. Nakamura, tell these kids exactly what we're going to do, step by step. No surprises. The team moved with practiced efficiency despite the unfamiliar circumstances. Rodriguez located a broken desk frame that could serve as a temporary ceiling support, while Kowalski found a length of iron pipe that had once been part of the building's water system. Morrison positioned himself to monitor the structure's stability, watching for any signs of imminent collapse. As they worked, Brennan knelt near the children, speaking softly while Nakamura translated. He explained each step of the rescue plan, showing them the tools they would use, demonstrating how they would lift the beam. The oldest boy listened intently, his protective instincts warring with his growing realization that these Americans genuinely intended to help. What's his name? Brennan asked Nakamura. Kenji. He's 12. His father died in the Philippines last year. Brennan met the boy's eyes. Through Nakamura, he said, Kenji, I need your help. When we lift this beam, you need to pull Yuki free quickly but carefully. Can you do that? The question surprised the boy. His eyes widened slightly. The American sergeant was asking for his assistance, treating him as a partner rather than an enemy or a victim. After a moment, Kenji nodded slowly. Ready, Morrison said, positioning the makeshift ceiling support. On 3, 1, Aoki 2, 3. Rodriguez and Kowalski applied pressure to the iron pipe, using it as a lever beneath the fallen beam. The timber groaned and shifted slightly, just enough to create a gap. Kenji moved instantly, carefully pulling Yuki's injured leg free, while the little girl bit her lip to keep from crying out. Got her, Kenji called in English, one of the few phrases he knew. Down! Morrison shouted as the ceiling support cracked. The team released the beam and dove backward as a section of roof tiles crashed down exactly where they'd been standing moments before. Dust exploded through the room and the entire building shuddered. Move, now! Brennan ordered, scooping up Yuki in his arms while Nakamura guided the other children toward the exit. Kenji helped a younger boy who'd frozen in panic, practically dragging him across the debris-strewn floor. They tumbled out through the western entrance just as a deep, thunderous groan emanated from within the schoolhouse. The main support beam Morrison had warned about finally gave way, and the entire eastern half of the building collapsed inward with a deafening crash. Dust and smoke billowed out through every opening, and tiles rained down across the hillside. The team scrambled further down the slope, putting distance between themselves and the wreckage. When they finally stopped, Brennan gently set Yuki down on a clear patch of ground and immediately began examining her leg. The wound was deep but clean. The beam had caught her below the knee, crushing tissue but apparently not breaking bone. Rodriguez, medical kit, Brennan called out, already tearing away the damaged fabric of Yuki's pants to better assess the injury. The little girl whimpered but didn't pull away, her enormous eyes fixed on his face as if trying to reconcile this gentle treatment with everything she'd been taught about Americans. Corporal Michael Chen, the unit's medic who'd been waiting at the base of the hill, arrived breathless. Let me see, he said, kneeling beside them. Chen had served since Guadalcanal and had patched up more wounds than he cared to remember. He worked quickly, cleaning the injury and applying sulfa powder before wrapping it in clean gauze. She'll be okay, Chen said in English, then repeated it in halting Japanese he'd picked up over the past months. Daijobu desu. Yuki's eyes filled with tears, not from pain but from confusion and overwhelming relief. She spoke softly to Nakamura. She says thank you, the translator said, his own voice thick with emotion. She says she thought monsters were coming to hurt them, but you're not monsters. You're... She doesn't have the word, She means kind men. Kenji stood nearby, watching the entire scene with an expression of profound bewilderment. He'd spent years hearing stories of American savagery, preparing himself mentally to die bravely if the invasion came. Instead, these Americans had risked their lives for children they didn't know, in a country that had been their enemy just days ago. He approached Brennan slowly and bowed deeply, a formal gesture of respect that he'd been taught to reserve for honored elders and superior officers. When he straightened, he spoke carefully in Japanese. Nakamura translated. He says his understanding of the world has been shattered today. He says he will remember what you did, he says. He wants to know why. Brennan looked at the boy for a long moment, then at the other children gathered around them, alive because a group of American soldiers had decided that some things transcended nationality and conflict. Tell him, Brennan said slowly, that we're soldiers, not murderers. Tell him we fight to protect the innocent, not harm them. Tell him that's what makes us different from what he was taught. And tell him that I hope someday he'll teach his own children to see people as people first before anything else. As Nakamura translated, Kenji's eyes glistened with tears he refused to let fall. He nodded once, sharply, committing the words to memory. Chapter 3. The village transformed. News of the rescue spread through Shirahama like wildfire. By the time Brennan's team descended the hillside with the children, half the village had gathered to witness their return. The crowd stood in stunned silence as they watched American soldiers carrying their children, treating their wounds, offering water and candy from their rations. Yuki's mother broke from the crowd with a cry of relief, rushing forward before stopping abruptly, uncertain whether she was permitted to approach. Brennan smiled and carried Yuki to her, gently transferring the girl into her mother's trembling arms. The woman clutched her daughter close, tears streaming down her face as she bowed repeatedly toward Brennan, words of gratitude tumbling out in Japanese. An elderly woman pressed forward, holding out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Through Nakamura, she explained it was rice cakes, nearly the last food her family had, and she insisted the soldiers take them as thanks. Brennan accepted with a respectful bow, understanding the significance of the gesture. Lieutenant Morrison, observing the transformation in the villagers' demeanor, saw an opportunity. Nakamura, ask the headmen if they would accept our help with supplies. We can arrange for medical care, food distribution, basic necessities until the occupation administration gets organized. What followed over the next several days became a model for American-Japanese interaction in the early occupation period. The village of Shirahama, which had cowered in fear of the arriving Americans, gradually opened itself to cooperation. The transformation wasn't instantaneous or complete. Centuries of cultural pride and weeks of propaganda couldn't be erased overnight, but the rescue of the children had cracked the wall of fear and hatred. Brennan's unit established a small aid station in the village square, where Corporal Chen treated minor injuries and illnesses. Initially, only a few brave souls approached. But when word spread that the American medic had successfully treated old Hayashi's infected hand and young Tomoko's fever, more villagers began arriving. Private Kowalski, surprisingly, proved to have a gift for connecting with the village children. Despite the language barrier, he taught them simple games: marbles, stickball, basic card tricks. His goofy smile and exaggerated gestures transcended language, and soon children followed him through the village like a Pied Piper, their laughter ringing out, where silence and fear had reigned days before. Kenji became an unexpected bridge between the two groups. His English, though limited, improved rapidly, and he began serving as an informal translator for younger children who wanted to communicate with the soldiers. He also took it upon himself to teach the Americans basic Japanese courtesy, correcting their pronunciation and explaining cultural nuances. One afternoon, Kenji approached Brennan with a request. Through a combination of English, Japanese, and gestures, he explained that many villagers, especially the elderly, were struggling with damaged homes. Winter would arrive in a few months, and without repairs, families would suffer. "You want us to help rebuild?" Brennan asked, making sure he understood correctly. Kenji nodded emphatically. "Please, we fix together?" Morrison, overhearing the conversation, immediately saw the value. Joint project. Americans and villagers working side by side. It would do more for relations than 100 official proclamations. The repair projects began the next day. American soldiers with construction experience worked alongside Japanese villagers, combining their knowledge and resources. Private Rodriguez demonstrated American framing techniques while elderly Japanese craftsmen showed the Americans traditional joinery methods that required no nails. The exchange of knowledge flowed both ways, breaking down barriers with every shared task. Private First Class Samuel Washington, an African-American soldier from Alabama, formed an unlikely friendship with Tanaka-san, the village headman. Despite the language barrier, they communicated through the universal language of carpentry, working together to rebuild a damaged community hall. Washington's experiences with discrimination in America gave him a unique perspective on the Japanese civilians' fear and suspicion, and his patient, respectful approach won considerable trust. Back home, plenty of folks see me as less than human too, Washington confided to Brennan one evening. Makes it easier to understand what these people are dealing with. They've been told lies about us, same way lies get told about my people. Not everyone in the village welcomed the American presence. A few older men, veterans of Japan's earlier wars, watched the cooperation with barely concealed anger. They saw collaboration with the occupiers as a betrayal of Japanese honor. One evening, Brennan overheard a heated argument in Japanese near the community hall. Nakamura translated, "The old soldier is saying they should maintain distance from us. He's calling the villagers who work with us traitors. He says accepting our help is shameful." The headman, Tanaka-san, responded with surprising firmness. Nakamura continued translating. "He's telling the old soldier that what's shameful is letting children suffer because of pride. He says the Americans proved themselves when they risked their lives for Japanese children. He says honor demands recognizing courage and kindness even in a former enemy." The old soldier had no response to that. He turned and walked away, his rigid posture broadcasting his disapproval, but he didn't interfere with the reconstruction efforts. Yuki's recovery became something of a village celebration. Her leg healed well under Chen's care, and the day she took her first steps without assistance, the entire village seemed to hold its breath. When she successfully crossed the village square to where Brennan stood, then bowed politely and said thank you in careful English, spontaneous applause broke out from the assembled villagers. Her mother approached Brennan through Nakamura. "She wants you to know that you gave her back her daughter's life. She says in her culture that creates a debt that can never be fully repaid, but she wants you to know that you will always be remembered in this family. Your name will be spoken with respect for generations." Brennan, uncomfortable with such formal gratitude, simply replied, "I did what anyone should do. She's a brave kid. You should be proud of her." But the gesture's significance went beyond one child's rescue. In the evenings, when the day's work finished, villagers began inviting soldiers to share meals in their homes. The portions were small, food remained scarce, but the symbolism was profound. Families who'd expected monsters instead found themselves breaking bread with young men who showed them photographs of their own families, who laughed at children's antics, who treated their hosts with courtesy and respect. Morrison recognized the strategic importance of what was happening in Shirahama. He filed detailed reports with division headquarters, noting how a single act of compassion had transformed an entire village's perception of the occupation. His reports would eventually influence occupation policy, encouraging similar community engagement across Japan. Chapter 4. Ripples across the water. 3 weeks after the rescue, a formal ceremony took place in Shirahama's reconstructed community hall. Division Command had gotten word of the village's transformation and sent observers to document what they saw as a potential model for occupation success. But for the soldiers and villagers involved, the ceremony meant something far more personal. The hall had been beautifully restored through joint American-Japanese effort, its traditional architecture preserved while incorporating modern structural improvements. Paper lanterns hung from the rafters, and someone had arranged chrysanthemums, Japan's imperial flower, in careful displays. Tanaka-san, the headman, stood before the assembled crowd of villagers and soldiers. Through Nakamura's translation, he spoke about the day the Americans arrived, about the fear that had gripped the village, about the prejudice and propaganda that had poisoned minds against the occupiers. Then he spoke about the schoolhouse, about 5 children trapped in the rubble, about American soldiers who risked their lives without hesitation for Japanese children they'd never met. His voice broke as he described Sergeant Brennan carrying little Yuki down the hillside, treating her wounds with the same care he would show his own nieces and nephews. "We were taught to see you as demons," Tanaka-san said, his words carrying through Nakamura to the American soldiers. "We were taught that surrender meant death and dishonor. We were taught to fear you more than we feared death itself. But you showed us something different. You showed us that humanity transcends nationality. You showed us that compassion has no borders." He bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect, and the entire village followed his lead. For a long moment, the American soldiers stood uncertain, moved by the gesture but unsure how to respond. Then Brennan stepped forward and returned the bow with equal formality. Behind him, his entire unit followed suit. The simple exchange, East meeting West with mutual respect, drew tears from many in the audience. The children who'd been rescued, Kenji, Yuki, and the 3 others, came forward carrying a large wooden plaque they'd helped create under the guidance of village craftsmen. Burned into the wood in both Japanese and English were the words, "In honor of the American soldiers who showed us the meaning of true courage. Shirahama, August 1945. Kenji, now confident in his role as bridge between cultures, spoke in English he'd practiced carefully. "You save us, you show us Americans are good people. We will never forget. We will tell our children, and our children's children. You change everything for us." Morrison accepted the plaque on behalf of the unit, his usual military composure cracking slightly. "We did what we hope anyone would do. We did what was right. And we hope that from this day forward, Americans and Japanese can build something better together than the war that divided us." The ceremony concluded with a shared meal, a feast by the village's limited standards, with each family contributing what they could spare. American military rations supplemented Japanese cooking, creating a fusion that symbolized the cultural exchange taking place. Soldiers and civilians sat together, communicating through a mixture of improving Japanese, broken English, and universal gestures. Private Kowalski ended up in an impromptu game of catch with a group of village boys, using a ball made of wrapped rags. Private Washington discussed woodworking techniques with Tanaka-san through elaborate pantomime. Corporal Chen examined an elderly woman's arthritis, explaining through Nakamura which exercises might help reduce her pain. Brennan found himself sitting with Kenji and Yuki's family. The boy had become remarkably proficient in English over the past weeks, and he served as translator for his family's questions about America, about Brennan's home, about what life was like for ordinary Americans. "Is it true," Kenji asked carefully, "that in America, people from many countries live together? Japanese, Chinese, German, all together?" "It's true," Brennan confirmed. "We're not perfect. We have our problems, our prejudices. But yes, people from all over the world come to America and become Americans. It's one of our country's greatest strengths." Kenji considered this thoughtfully. I think Japan must learn this too. Must learn that being strong doesn't mean hating everyone different. Your country fought us, but now you help us. You are strong enough to be kind. That is real strength." The wisdom in the 12-year-old's words struck Brennan deeply. This boy, who'd lost his father to war and nearly lost his own life in a collapsed building, had somehow found his way to a profound truth about strength and humanity. As the evening wore on and the lanterns glowed brighter against the darkening sky, stories circulated through the gathering. Villagers shared their fears from the days before American arrival, laughing now at misconceptions that had seemed so real at the time. Soldiers talked about their own preconceptions about Japan and Japanese people, admitting how wrong they'd been about many things. Washington shared a particularly poignant moment with the old soldier, who'd objected to cooperation with the Americans. Through Nakamura, they discussed their respective wars. Washington's service across the Pacific, the old soldier's time in Manchuria. Despite the language barrier and their former enemy status, they found common ground in the shared experience of combat, the loss of comrades, the desire for peace. He says, Nakamura translated, that he was wrong to oppose the cooperation. He says, watching you work alongside our people, seeing the respect you show to our culture and traditions, he understands now that occupation doesn't have to mean destruction. He says you've given him hope that Japan can rebuild with honor. The evening's emotional high point came when Yuki, who'd been practicing in secret, performed a traditional song with several other village children. Her clear voice rose in a folk melody about hope and renewal, and when she finished, she presented Brennan with a paper crane she'd folded herself, a symbol of peace and healing in Japanese culture. She says, her mother translated through Nakamura, tears in her eyes, that you gave her back her life, so she wants to give you something beautiful. She says when you look at it, remember that one act of kindness can change everything. Brennan accepted the delicate origami with hands that weren't quite steady. The simple paper bird folded by a child he'd pulled from rubble 3 weeks ago represented something far larger than itself. It represented the possibility of reconciliation, the power of compassion to transcend hatred, the hope that former enemies could become friends. As the ceremony concluded and soldiers prepared to return to their base, the farewells carried a warmth that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. Villagers pressed small gifts into soldiers' hands, handcrafted items, carefully preserved food, drawings from children. The Americans responded with whatever they could offer, extra rations, medical supplies, photographs they'd taken of the village and its people. Lieutenant Morrison pulled Brennan aside as they prepared to leave. Division wants to document what happened here. They're talking about using Shirahama as a model for occupation policy. What you did on that hillside, it's going to influence how we interact with Japanese civilians across the country. Brennan shook his head slightly. I just got some kids out of a collapsed building. Any decent person would have done the same. Maybe, Morrison replied. But you did it first, when it mattered most. When these people were still convinced we were monsters. You proved them wrong. You showed them that Americans value human life, even enemy lives. That matters, Brennan. That matters more than you know. As the truck convoy pulled away from Shirahama, Brennan looked back at the village. Lantern light illuminated the community hall where Americans and Japanese had shared food and stories. Children waved enthusiastically at the departing soldiers. Adults stood with hands raised in farewell, their faces reflecting a transformation from fear to friendship. Kenji stood at the front of the crowd, standing straight with dignity beyond his years. He raised his hand in a formal salute, not the American military salute, but a gesture of respect that bridged both cultures. Brennan returned it, understanding that this boy represented Japan's future. A future that might remember not just the war's destruction, but also the compassion that followed. The paper crane Yuki had given him rested carefully in Brennan's breast pocket, over his heart. It would travel back to America with him when his deployment ended, would sit on his desk for decades to come, would eventually be passed to his own children with the story of a burning schoolhouse, and 5 terrified children, and the moment when enemies became human beings to each other. In the years that followed, Shirahama would be cited in occupation reports, studied in military academies, referenced in histories of the post-war period. But for those who were there, soldiers and villagers alike, it would always be remembered simply as the place where compassion proved stronger than propaganda, where human decency transcended nationality, where a rescue mission became a bridge between cultures. The rescue of 5 children from a collapsed schoolhouse changed more than those individual lives. It changed a village's understanding of their former enemies. It influenced occupation policy across an entire nation. It demonstrated that even in the aftermath of history's most destructive war, the simple act of saving a child's life could plant seeds of reconciliation that would grow for generations. And in the end, that truth proved more powerful than all the weapons, propaganda, and hatred that war had produced. In the end, humanity prevailed.